What if the blood running through your veins remembered things your mind never could? What if buried inside your cells was a story stretching back 20,000 years, a story of ice, survival, invasion, and a mystery that scientists never expected to find? Before we go any further, if you love history that actually makes you feel something, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss a video like this, and share it with someone who deserves to know the truth about where we really come from. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to this channel. Now, Portugal, a small country at the edge of Europe. Most people think of it as a quiet place, beaches, wine, beautiful tiles on old buildings. But underneath the surface of that quiet country lies something that has made scientists genuinely stop and stare. Something they did not expect to find. Something that, once you understand it, will change the way you think about history, about identity, and about what it means to survive. Here is the question that started everything. When researchers pulled ancient DNA from bones buried in Portuguese soil, they expected to find the usual pattern, the kind of genetic history you find across most of Europe. Old populations wiped out by new ones, waves of migration washing everything clean, one people replaced by another, generation after generation, until the original signal disappears completely. That is what happened almost everywhere else, but not here. What they found instead was something that had never been seen before on this continent. Not a clean replacement, not a simple blending, something far more strange and far more beautiful than either of those things. They found a stack, layer upon layer upon layer, going all the way back to the Ice Age, each one still visible, each one still alive in the DNA of people walking the streets of Lisbon today. Every wave of history that should have erased what came before it had failed. Every invasion, every empire, every cultural revolution, and still the oldest blood on the continent was somehow still there. Still detectable, still running quietly underneath everything else. How? Why here? Why Portugal? To understand the answer, you have to go back. Not a few hundred years, not a few thousand. You have to go back 20,000 years to a time when most of Europe was dying. The last great ice age was at its worst. Glaciers, a mile thick, covered everything from what is now Scotland all the way down through northern France and Germany. The forests were gone. The rivers were frozen. The animals that people depended on had either migrated south or vanished entirely. Europe was becoming uninhabitable, and the small, scattered bands of hunter-gatherers who had called this continent home were running out of options. They moved south. They had to. And at the very southwestern edge of the continent, where the land finally runs out and the Atlantic Ocean begins, there was something miraculous waiting for them. A strip of coastline that the glaciers could not reach. A place where the ocean kept the winters mild, where rivers still flowed freely, where rocky shores were rich with shellfish and estuaries, where forests of oak still stood heavy with acorns, where wild boar still moved through the undergrowth. And while the rest of Europe went silent under ice and snow, this edge of the world stayed alive. The people who found their way here were some of the oldest human populations in all of European prehistory. Genetic researchers call them Magdalenian associated populations. These were the same people whose ancestors had painted extraordinary scenes of bison and horses on cave walls across southern France and northern Spain. They were skilled, resilient, and they had been living on this continent for tens of thousands of years. And here, at the far western edge of everything, they waited, not for years, not for decades, for thousands of years. This corner of Iberia was their home, their refuge, and eventually their permanent identity. When the ice finally retreated, something remarkable happened across most of Europe. A new wave of people, expanding westward from what is now Italy and the broader Mediterranean region, spread a different genetic signature across the continent. And wherever this new wave went, the old Magdalenian lineages faded. They mixed, they diluted, and ultimately they disappeared from the detectable genetic record almost everywhere on the continent. Almost everywhere. In western Iberia, in the land that would one day become Portugal, the old bloodline held. Not completely unchanged, because nothing in human genetics ever is, but it survived in a proportion found almost nowhere else on the continent. Researchers discovered that ancient Iberian hunter-gatherers carried a remarkable dual ancestry. They had absorbed elements of the newer populations, yes, but the original Ice Age signature remained strong. Stubbornly, unexpectedly, beautifully strong. And that was just the beginning. Around 7,500 years ago, farmers arrived. Not overland, through mountain passes, by sea, small wooden boats hugging the Mediterranean coastline, carrying grain, livestock, and pottery, coming from somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean and following the curve of the European coast. Westward for generations, until they finally rounded the corner into the open Atlantic and found what would become Portugal. These were Anatolian farmers. Their ancestors had invented agriculture thousands of years earlier in what is now Turkey and the surrounding regions. And as they moved westward through Europe over many generations, they transformed every landscape they encountered. They cleared forests. They planted fields. they built the first permanent settlements. And wherever they went, their numbers eventually overwhelmed the hunter-gatherers who had been there before. This happened across Central Europe. It happened in the north. In most places, the genetic math was brutal and simple. More farmers than hunters, more resources, more children, and within a few generations, the ancient lineages faded to almost nothing. But in Portugal, it went differently. The farmers arrived, and the people who were already there did not disappear. They did not flee. They stayed. And within a generation or two, the two groups were having children together. The genetic evidence is precise about this. The early farming communities in Portugal carried roughly 2/3 Anatolian farmer ancestry and 1/3 ancestry from the hunter-gatherers who had been sheltering on this coast since the Ice Age. 1/3. That sounds simple. But scientists emphasize that this proportion was dramatically higher than almost anywhere else in Europe. In most of the continent, the local hunter-gatherer contribution to early farming communities was tiny. Here it was substantial, meaningful, a genuine partnership written in DNA. There's a cave in the limestone hills of central Portugal called Cova das Lapas. Inside it, researchers found two young men buried side by side. Brothers, the bones suggested. And when ancient DNA was extracted from their remains, it confirmed exactly this story. Their genetic profile showed the blend clearly. Anatolian farmer mixed with Iberian hunter-gatherer. But there was something else too, something that made researchers pause. Their mitochondrial DNA, the genetic lineage passed through the maternal line, reached all the way back to the Ice Age populations who had sheltered in these very hills during the worst of the glaciation. These brothers, living and dying thousands of years ago, were carrying inside them the full memory of what this place had been. Two worlds, two histories, one family buried together in limestone that had watched over all of it. Something about this land held onto its people, or maybe, as I keep thinking, it was the other way around. The people held onto the land. Now I want you to pause for a second and think about what you just heard. We have already moved through 10,000 years of history, and the story is just getting started. Every layer we have talked about should have been the final one. But every single time, something survived. Something persisted. That pattern, the persistence, is going to become the most important theme of everything that follows. And if you are finding this as fascinating as I am, do me a quick favor. Drop a comment below telling me which part of this story surprised you. Quick favor. Drop a comment below telling me which part of this story surprised you the most so far. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about real history, and I read every single one. Around 4,500 years ago, everything was about to change again, and this time, the change was so dramatic, so complete, and so mysterious that scientists still argue about what exactly caused it. From the vast open grasslands north of the Black Sea, from the steppes of what is now Russia and Ukraine, a new group of people began moving. They were not farmers in the traditional sense. They were herders, mobile, fast-moving, organized around horses and cattle and the ability to cover enormous distances quickly. They had domesticated horses. They had bronze weapons. They had wheeled wagons that let them carry everything they owned. Across the landscape at speeds no farming village could match. And wherever they went in Europe, the genetic record shows the same pattern, a massive replacement of what had been there before. When these steppe migrants reached Iberia, they repeated it. Over the course of roughly 4 centuries, something extraordinary and deeply unsettling happened. The male lineages of the entire peninsula were overwritten. Not partially, not in certain regions, nearly all of them. The Y chromosome, which passes from father to son, shifted almost completely from the lineages that had been building in Iberia for thousands of years to a single paternal line from the eastern grasslands. Researchers estimate that the total ancestry of the Iberian Peninsula shifted by around 40% during this period. But among males, the replacement was close to total, 4 centuries. Every man on a peninsula the size of Portugal and Spain, and the ancient paternal lines that had been there since before farming, before pottery, before any of the history we usually talk about, gone, replaced by something that arrived from thousands of miles away. Now here is what makes this so deeply strange. The archaeology from this period does not show the kind of evidence you would expect from a violent conquest. There are no layers of burned buildings, no mass graves that look like massacres, no defensive walls thrown up in desperation around villages trying to hold off invaders. The soil does not tell a story of obvious, sudden violence, just a slow, generation-by-generation replacement of one population's male lineage by another, unfolding across 4 centuries, silent in the ground. At a burial site in southern Spain called Castillejo de Bonet, archaeologists made a discovery that stopped everyone who heard about it cold. A man and a woman buried side by side, placed together carefully, deliberately, with offerings around them as if they had belonged to each other in life. The woman's ancestry was entirely local. Her lineage stretched back through the farmers, through the hunter-gatherers, through thousands of years of Iberian history. The man was not local at all. His most recent ancestors had come from Central Europe. His Y chromosome traced back to the steppe. Two people, two completely different genetic worlds, buried together as if they were simply two people who had loved each other. And somewhere in the silence between those two skeletons lies the entire mystery of what happened. The scientists can see the pattern in the data. They can measure the replacement, but they cannot tell you why. Was it status? Did the newcomers hold higher social standing, control more resources, and become more desirable partners across many generations? Was it something more coercive that left no mark in stone or soil? One population geneticist who led a landmark study of Iberian DNA described the results as astonishing. The genetic data, he said, pointed to a transformation that simply was not visible in the archaeology. Two completely different stories, one told by the bones, one told by the blood. Here is the irony that I find almost poetic. The Bell-Beaker culture, one of the most influential cultural movements in all of prehistoric Europe, appears to have originated in Portugal. Those distinctive bell-shaped ceramic drinking vessels first appeared near the Tagus estuary around 4,700 years ago. Within centuries, the style had spread from Iberia all the way to the British Isles and deep into Central Europe. Portugal sent a culture outward that reshaped an entire continent. And then, almost immediately after, that same continent sent people back who quietly rewrote Portugal's male bloodlines from the inside. A culture moved west to east. The people moved east to west, and neither one fully understood what the other was doing. The stack was growing taller, but it was nowhere near finished. When Rome arrived in Iberia in the 3rd century BC, it did not come with soldiers alone. It came with roads. The Romans were obsessed with connectivity. They built highways across the entire peninsula, linking cities that had never spoken to each other, opening corridors for trade, for soldiers, for merchants, for everyone who followed in the legion's wake. There is a tiny village in the hills near the Spanish border called Idanha Avella. Today, it is nearly abandoned. A few dozen people, crumbling Roman walls, golden grass rolling across the hillside in every direction. But 2,000 years ago, it sat at a crossroads of empire. The roads from the coast met the roads from the interior right there. It was a circulation point, a place where the blood of the empire literally moved through. And the DNA from burials at that site tells a story that should be on every history curriculum in the world. North African ancestry, Eastern Mediterranean ancestry, local Iberian ancestry going back to the Neolithic, all mixed together in one small hilltop town beneath a sky that has barely changed since. Think about that daily reality for a moment. A merchant from the coast of North Africa doing business next to a family whose roots reached back to the first farmers who cleared these same valleys 5,000 years earlier. A soldier from Syria or Egypt stationed at a distant frontier garrison, meeting someone, staying, having children who carried Rome and Iberia and Africa all at once, children who thought nothing of it, who were simply alive. Then Rome fell, the roads went quiet, and new waves came. Germanic tribes, the Suebi, and then the Visigoths swept in from the north. New genetic threads, new cultural layers, new words left behind in a language that was slowly becoming Portuguese. And then came the rupture that changed the south of Portugal more profoundly than almost anything before it. In 711, armies from North Africa crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and moved through Iberia with a speed that stunned everyone who witnessed it. Within 7 years, they had reached the northern mountains, and for the next 5 centuries, Islamic civilization ruled significant parts of what is now Portugal. 500 years. That is longer than the United States has existed as a country. Long enough for entire generations to be born, grow old, and die without ever knowing anything different. Long enough for the culture, the language, the food, the architecture, and yes, the blood to mix in ways that no later political reversal could undo. The genetic evidence makes this undeniable. Southern Portugal absorbed substantial North African ancestry during the Islamic centuries. Not a faint trace, not an ambiguous signal. A real, measurable, significant contribution to the gene pool, still clearly visible in modern DNA today. When the Christian kingdoms pushed south in the Reconquista and retook the territory, they changed the flags and converted the mosques. They could not change what 5 centuries of shared life had written into the cells of the people who had been living there together. Blood does not submit to political decrees. What is even more striking is what happened in the north during that same period. While the south was absorbing centuries of North African and Moorish influence, northern Portugal saw almost none of it. The mountains, the rivers, and the political boundary between Christian and Islamic-held territory created a divide so complete, so persistent, that it is still visible in DNA 1,000 years later. Modern Portuguese people from the north and south carry measurably different genetic profiles. A boundary drawn by medieval armies has become a boundary encoded in cells. Walk from Porto to Faro, and you are crossing a genetic border that is older than any road you will travel on to get there. That is one of the most haunting things. This entire body of research reveals history does not disappear, it hides, it waits. And it shows up 1,000 years later in a lab test that nobody expected to be reading quite this carefully. All right, I need to stop here for a moment, because we are about to get to the part of this story that I think is the most powerful of all, and I want to make sure you're with me for it. If you have watched this far, you already know this is not your average history content. So do yourself a favor. Subscribe right now if you have not yet. Turn on notifications. Because the next video we are working on is going to be just as deep and just as surprising as this one. You do not want to miss it. Now, the Sephardic story. Jewish communities had been part of Iberian life for centuries before what happened next. Some historians believe their presence in Portugal goes back further than Rome, possibly as far back as Phoenician and Greek traders working the Atlantic coast thousands of years ago. By the medieval period, they were not a small or marginal group. They were physicians serving royal courts, merchants who had built trading networks stretching across the Mediterranean, scholars, cartographers, translators, neighbors, families who had lived beside Christian Portuguese families for so many generations that the communities were thoroughly, deeply intertwined. Then came 1497. Portugal's King Manuel Firmp issued an edict. Every Jewish person in the country had to convert to Christianity or leave. The choice was that simple on paper. The reality was catastrophic. Many families were forcibly baptized in mass ceremonies, dragged to the font, given names they had not chosen, handed an identity they had not asked for. Thousands fled, carrying their language, their culture, and their memories into exile across the Ottoman Empire, the Netherlands, North Africa, anywhere that would take them. These exiled communities would keep speaking a form of medieval Portuguese for generations, preserving in their speech a version of a homeland they had been expelled from. But many stayed. They converted publicly. They attended church. They gave their children saints' names. They said the right words in the right buildings. And then they went home and closed the shutters. Behind closed doors in rooms with covered windows, these families continued to practice their faith in secret, lighting candles on Friday evenings, observing fasts that did not correspond to any Christian calendar, teaching their children prayers in Hebrew that the children memorized phonetically, not fully understanding the words they were preserving, only understanding that the words mattered and that they must not forget them. These were the conversos, the hidden ones, the families who chose silence over exile and passed that silence down through generation after generation after generation. And their DNA stayed too. Genetic studies have found that roughly 1 in 5 people across the Iberian Peninsula carry genetic markers consistent with Sephardic Jewish ancestry. 1 in 5. After 5 centuries of forced conversion. After the Inquisition, with its tribunals and its torture chambers and its obsessive determination to root out secret practice. 1 in 5. After 5 centuries of forced conversion. After the Inquisition, with its tribunals and its torture chambers and its obsessive determination to root out secret practice. After cultural erasure so thorough that entire family histories were rewritten, surnames changed, origins forgotten or deliberately hidden. The code survived, hidden in plain sight, passed from parent to child through dozens of generations of people who may have had no idea what they were carrying. A memory encoded deeper than language, deeper than religion, deeper than any identity a government tried to impose or erase. You could burn the books, you could change the names, you could build churches on top of synagogues, you could not reach what was written in the cells. And this is where I want to bring everything together, because the Sephardic story is not separate from the rest of what we have talked about. It is the same story, told one more time. Look at what we have moved through. Ice Age hunter-gatherers who should have been replaced by incoming farmers, but were not. Early farming communities that should have been genetically overwhelmed by steppe migrants, but left a trace that persisted for thousands of years. A steppe replacement so complete that it rewrote the male lineage of an entire peninsula, but could not touch the female lines. Roman cosmopolitanism that mixed North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean into a small Portuguese hilltop town and left markers that are still there 2,000 years later. 5 centuries of Islamic rule that wrote North African ancestry into the south of Portugal so deeply that a political reconquest could not undo it. And Sephardic families who survived. 500 years of institutional erasure by passing their genetic identity silently from one generation to the next. Every single layer should have been destroyed by what followed it. None of them were. This is not an accident of geography. Portugal is not just a place where people happen to survive. It is evidence of something deeper about the nature of human persistence, about what people do when the world changes around them faster than they can adapt to consciously. They stay, they love whoever is next to them, they have children, and they carry forward everything that came before them, even the parts they do not know they are carrying. The most comprehensive genetic study ever conducted on Portugal drew DNA from 67 ancient individuals spanning 5,000 years. Farmers and warriors, Roman-era subjects and medieval villagers, each one sequenced and compared, and the picture that emerged was unlike anything seen anywhere else in Europe. Not a melting pot, where everything blends into something uniform. A stack. Distinct layers, each one visible, each one traceable, none of them fully gone. That word, stack, matters. Because a stack is not a simple mix. In a mix, the original ingredients disappear. In a stack, you can still see each layer. You can still identify where it came from. You can still trace its edges. That is what Portuguese DNA looks like to a researcher holding the data, a record of everything that was ever here, compressed into the genetic material of people alive right now. Think about what that means for a moment. Every person in Portugal today is walking around carrying this entire story inside them, not as memory, is walking around carrying this entire story inside them, not as memory, not as cultural knowledge, but as biology, as code. The Ice Age is in there. The first farmers crossing the sea are in there. The steppe herders who rewrote the male lines are in there. Rome is in there. North Africa is in there. The families who hid their candles behind closed shutters are in there. None of them knew they were building something that would last this long. The two brothers buried in that limestone cave in central Portugal had no idea. They were just brothers. They lived in a place that felt like home because it was. They ate together, hunted together, slept close to the same fire. The wave of steppe migrants was still 1,000 years in the future. Rome was thousands of years away. The Inquisition was so far beyond the horizon of any possible imagination that it might as well not have existed yet in any sense that mattered. But if you could unspool the DNA of a modern Portuguese person backward through time, layer by layer, you would eventually reach those brothers. Their ancestors are still woven into the code, still present, still part of the signal that researchers can read today. That is not just history, that is something closer to miracle. And here is what I want to leave you with, because I think this is the part that matters beyond Portugal, beyond genetics, beyond the specific details of any one study or any one people. We talk about history as if it is something that happens and then ends, as if the past is behind us, as if the people who came before us are truly gone. But the genetic record of places like Portugal says something different. It says the past does not end, it compresses, it layers, it becomes invisible to the eye. But it does not disappear. The choices people made in rooms that no longer exist, in languages nobody speaks anymore, in circumstances we can barely imagine, those choices are still here, still present in living human beings who wake up every morning with no idea they are carrying 20,000 years of survival in their cells. The Ice Age refugees who sheltered on the Atlantic coast did not survive the glacier so that their DNA could persist into the 21st century. They survived because they were cold and frightened, and they found a warm place with food and shelter, and they stayed. The Sephardic families who hid behind closed shutters did not protect their genetic heritage as a conscious act. They were terrified people, trying to hold on to something sacred in the only way available to them. But the result of all of it, the terrified and the hopeful and the brave and the people who simply had no choice, is a record encoded in the most durable material the universe has produced, more durable than stone, more durable than language, more durable than empire or law or religion. You carry it too, not Portuguese DNA specifically, but a stack of your own. Every place your ancestors sheltered, every time they survived something that should have ended them, every quiet act of love or desperation or sheer stubbornness that resulted eventually in you being here and alive and watching this video, all of it is in there. All of it persisted. That should mean something. It does mean something. If this video reached something in you the way this research reached something in me, I want to ask you for one last thing. Not a like, not a subscription, though I genuinely appreciate both. I want you to share this with someone in your life who you think is ready to hear it. Someone who loves history. Someone who has ever wondered where they really come from. Someone who needs to be reminded that the people who came before us were not just names in a textbook. They were real. They were scared and hopeful and stubborn. And in ways that science is only now beginning to fully measure, they are still here. That is the story of Portuguese DNA. And in some form or another, it is the story of all of us.